The airport was never quiet, but in that moment, the noise felt distant, like the world had softened just enough to let one fragile decision take center stage. The final boarding announcement echoed through the terminal as James Matthews stood frozen near the gate, his fingers clenched around a creased boarding pass. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion, the kind that came not just from long days, but from long years of carrying responsibility alone. 3 relentless days of desperate networking at a business conference had drained every ounce of energy he had. All he wanted now was to get on that plane, fly home, and hold his daughter again. And then it happened. His name cut through the noise with unmistakable authority, spoken loudly enough that conversations paused and heads turned. James Matthews. Time seemed to slow as he looked up. Standing there, breathless and determined, was Eliza Montgomery, the CEO of Montgomery Innovations, one of the most powerful women in the tech world. Her usually composed presence was cracked open, replaced by something raw and unguarded. She looked nothing like the woman who had commanded a stage during her keynote. She looked human, vulnerable. She reached him just as the line of passengers began to move. Her voice was firm, but her eyes betrayed everything she wasn't saying. She didn't want him to fly home yet. She wanted him to stay. Just for tonight. James felt his chest tighten. 3 days ago, he had been invisible. Just another struggling single father with a half-finished dream and a cheaply printed banner. Now the most influential woman in the industry was asking him, publicly, to pause his life and consider something unexpected. The decision in front of him wasn't only about missing a flight. It was about whether he was ready to loosen the boundaries he had wrapped around his heart since becoming a widower. Eliza Montgomery had never planned on running through an airport at 42 years old. Her life was built on precision. Every hour accounted for, every decision weighed and calculated. Emotional restraint had been her armor in a world that demanded certainty. But something about James Matthews had slipped past her defenses. Over 3 days, the carefully stacked walls of her life had begun to crumble. The thought of him leaving, without knowing how deeply he had affected her, was suddenly unbearable. Their story had started quietly, almost forgettably, in the cavernous conference center of a downtown hotel. James had been struggling to set up his small booth for the startup showcase. His banner refused to stay upright, collapsing again and again as attendees walked past without a second glance. His budget hadn't allowed for polished displays or hired help. Everything he had was riding on this conference. His savings, his daughter's future, his late wife's belief in him. When the banner fell for the 3rd time, knocking over his prototype tablet, the defeat on his face caught Eliza's attention as she passed by. She stopped, set down her leather portfolio, and reached for the fallen stand before James could protest. In minutes, she fixed a flaw he had been fighting for half an hour. What she did next mattered more. She looked at his work. Really looked. James found himself explaining the educational app he built for children with different learning styles. His voice, shaky at first, then steadier as he realized she was genuinely listening. He spoke about his daughter, Sophie, about ADHD and dyslexia, about nights spent coding after bedtime, driven by a need to create something the existing systems had failed to provide. Something in Eliza's eyes changed. Her interest wasn't professional anymore. It was personal. That brief conversation shifted the course of both their lives. She offered feedback. She challenged his assumptions. She handed him her card. Not the glossy corporate one, but a simple card with her personal number written on the back. She told him to call after the showcase. One call turned into coffee. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into hours of conversation that stretched late into the night. James shared his journey through grief. The loss of his wife Lisa 3 years earlier, the steep learning curve of single parenthood, and the quiet fear of failing the one person who depended entirely on him. Eliza surprised herself by sharing, too. She spoke of leadership loneliness, of sacrifices she had justified for years, of wondering if success without connection was enough. By the second day, she was introducing him to investors. By the third, their conversations had shifted from pitches to possibilities. What had begun as mentorship had deepened into connection, the kind that feels rare because it's honest, the kind that makes returning to real life feel harder than it should. That was how they ended up at the airport, surrounded by strangers who had no idea they were witnessing a turning point. James thought of his phone in his pocket, of his daughter waiting for her nightly call, of the fragile routine that kept their small world stable. Eliza knew all of that. She wasn't asking him to abandon responsibility. She was asking for time, a few hours to acknowledge what was happening before life pulled them back to separate paths. The final boarding call came again, sharper this time. A gate agent looked at him expectantly. James felt his heart pound as he made the hardest kind of decision, the kind without a clear right answer. He stepped aside, dialed his neighbor, and asked for one more night. The relief that followed felt like exhaling after holding his breath for years. That night, after explaining everything to Sophie through a video call filled with curiosity and unexpected excitement, James and Eliza finally allowed themselves to talk openly about the distance, the complications, the realities they couldn't ignore. There were no fairy tale promises. Only honesty. Only questions. Only the quiet understanding that something meaningful deserved exploration. A week later, Eliza arrived in Portland. James worried his modest home would feel insignificant compared to her world. But she arrived dressed simply, nervous and genuine. Sophie erased any remaining tension the moment she ran forward, introducing herself with unfiltered enthusiasm. In minutes, the walls James feared would divide their lives dissolved into laughter. The weekend unfolded gently. Eliza listened more than she spoke. She sat on the floor, examined rock collections, and absorbed the rhythm of James and Sophie's life. She didn't fix or manage. She showed up. James watched, stunned, as the woman who commanded boardrooms gave herself fully to a child's world without pretense. When they finally had time alone, they talked about fear, about balance, about how both of them had built lives that worked, but maybe didn't fully satisfy. Eliza admitted she was rethinking the way she lived, realizing that achievement without shared joy felt incomplete. James admitted he had hidden behind responsibility, afraid that loving again might fracture the stability he had fought so hard to create. What followed wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was deliberate. Months of distance bridged by effort. Missed calls, long nights. Flights taken not out of convenience, but commitment. Sophie became the steady center, her honesty grounding them when doubts surfaced. The turning point came on an ordinary day when everything felt too heavy. Sophie had a setback at school that shook her confidence. James felt helpless from exhaustion and frustration. He didn't ask Eliza for anything. He simply told her. She arrived that night without hesitation, without luggage, without excuses. She sat beside Sophie, offered understanding instead of solutions, and left behind something more valuable than reassurance: presence. Later, on the quiet porch, the truth became undeniable. They weren't building something theoretical anymore. They were already a family in motion, shaped by choice rather than circumstance. When Eliza eventually moved to Portland, the world saw a strategic expansion. James and Sophie saw a homecoming. Life wasn't suddenly perfect. There were still routines, challenges, and compromises. But there was also laughter around a fuller table, shared mornings, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you don't have to carry everything alone. 1 year after that missed flight, they stood in the same terminal, boarding together this time. James looked back at the man he had been, desperate and unsure, and realized how close he had come to walking away from everything that mattered. Some journeys don't begin with certainty. They begin with courage, with a pause, with the willingness to choose connection over comfort, and possibility over fear. Because the most meaningful destinations aren't always printed on boarding passes. Sometimes they're found in the moments we dare to stay, to listen, and to believe that love doesn't need perfect timing to change everything. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep sharing stories of hope, second chances, and the quiet bravery it takes to choose love, even when the path isn't clear. And remember, sometimes missing the flight is exactly how you find your way home.